Hey guys, welcome to the K Nation Movement podcast. Today we're on episode 19. We have Kristie Rice on the show today. She has a Master of Science in Microbiology. She has studied CBD as well as gut health, and we're really excited to have her on the show today. Bell Let's Talk Day has just passed this following Wednesday, and essentially it's a day to raise awareness about mental health, and I think it was important to look at things that we can do to improve our mental health, which people would be surprised about. For example, improving your gut health. So today we talk about CBD, we talk about bacteria, we talk about probiotics, as well as improving your gut health, and really everything in between. So I'm excited to share this with you. I hope you enjoy it and have a great day. All right. Well, welcome to the show. I'm really glad to have you here because I think it's important for us to go into gut health a little bit deeper. We talked about it last week a lot with Dr. Paul Saladino, and I know that you know the idea of gut health and the mind-gut connection has been growing really popular, especially in recent years. So I think it's important to address it and go, in depth and figure out, what it's really about. But first of all, I want to know what your background is, what you studied, and kind of where you came from.
Yeah, so basically, originally when I started out, I got a bachelor's in biology, and it was just a general biology bachelor's degree. And the reason for that was because originally I wanted to go to veterinary school and become a veterinarian. And then I decided to go to Colorado. So originally I was in Las Vegas. I went to Colorado and I decided to get a master's in microbiology and immunology, but still was wanting to go to vet school from there. But once I started the master's program, I started learning so much more about research, more than I had ever known before, because I basically just had this one-track mind of going to vet school. And so it really fascinated me, especially the research side. So when I graduated from there, I ended up working in molecular diagnostics at the veterinary school. But at that point, I had started getting into keto. I started living that keto lifestyle, and I started becoming really passionate about the science and the research behind keto and low carb in general. So that's basically what my path has been. At this point, I'm not doing any sort of research or anything with it, but I hope to in the future get my PhD and then do something with that, which would be amazing.
Right. So what did you study specifically when you did your Master of Science? Was there like a thesis that you focused on?
Yeah, so actually my thesis, because I was living in Colorado and there was a lot of science at the time regarding cannabis use for animals, that's basically what my paper was on. So I looked at the use of cannabidiol in dogs and cats, or just in animals in general, just as a possible treatment for all different sorts of things, from seizures to cancer.
Right, and that's really interesting because the CBD craze has kind of taken over, especially with muscle treatment. So it's in a lot of creams now. It's tapping into the beauty sphere. So there's a lot of women's skincare that's now using CBD. Anything from muscle pain, joint pain, and I've seen it blowing up in the pet market as well. So it's big for, like you said, seizures and just general pain. So what did the research show for that? Because from what I understand, the research looks promising and it looks to be a very effective form of treatment.
Yeah, so the research is extremely promising. Luckily, because a lot of times before they do human studies, they do a lot of animal studies. And so there was a lot of good research in there. And the awesome thing, too, is the university that I went to, Colorado State University, they were getting ready to do clinical trials on CBD. So I got a lot of great information from that, and they were getting excellent results with it. The only problem that I was finding, though, in the literature was that there was no sort of set dosage. And so that's what Colorado State was looking to find. And the other thing, too, the other problem that there is within the industry is that there's not a lot of regulation. And so that's huge because THC is beneficial to an animal. It can actually cause more harm. And so if you're not regulating the cannabidiol industry, there's potential for animals to get injured or to even, die from that. And so that was the only
Right.
problem that I found. But there was just so much good research out there, just showing so much promise. And it made me excited because the university I was attending was actually, performing those clinical trials.
Yeah. Well, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was probably around the time that you went there when Colorado was legalizing as a state, right? And so I guess
They had
that,
already legalized.
oh, okay. So that opened up the doors for a lot of research, I'm guessing. And
Yes.
there was a piece on CNN that I saw a couple of years ago. I think it was with Sanjay Gupta, but he basically, I think he went to Colorado and he was talking to families who had children who had seizures, and they were dealing with a unique form of epilepsy. And so they were trying to get into the state just so they could get medicine for their children. The problem, like you said, with the dosage was that unless it came, in a form that was already pre-dosed, it was very hard for parents to try to extract the CBD, make it into the oil, and then figure out exactly how much, say, their children needed for it to completely, or completely reduce or minimize, their seizures. When they were showing in the interview, they interviewed a bunch of children. I think some of them, they went from having 100 or 200 seizures a day to like maybe one or two. So that was
Yeah.
really interesting. I'm sure it's very similar when it comes to pets as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to, it's anecdotal, but I've talked to so many people that had pets that had seizures that kind of the same thing. They were able to reduce the frequency of seizures or reduce them completely. And, it was actually through that research when I was looking at epilepsy or patients with Dravet syndrome that I started finding stuff about the ketogenic diet. And that's where my interest kind of started in that. But at the time, I was mostly focused on the CBD thing, and I don't know, my journey in education has been kind of this crazy winding road, but it's been fun.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand that. I mean, I went to school initially to become a dentist, and it was my fourth year where I got accepted to dental school in New York that I basically was like, whoa, is this really what I want to do? And it was a couple of years prior to that where I discovered keto and kind of had a passion for that, and so that led me down this crazy road of doing my Master of Science where I studied, the keto diet and its relationship with breast cancer and obesity, and the rest was history. I started my business sometime during my master's, and it's been a couple of years since, and I kind of never looked back because it was interesting how something like dentistry, which is so far different in my opinion from something like nutrition, unfolded. But sometimes you got to just follow the path, I guess, or where your heart lies.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought up the relationship with keto and how you kind of found that while you were studying, say, CBD for seizures, because in the 1920s, that's when keto was initially used to treat and prevent seizures in children with epilepsy, and it still is. I mean, there's a ton of clinics where they'll put children on ketogenic diets to minimize the amount of seizures that they have. So it is really interesting that those two worlds kind of collide. And what I think is most interesting is that, with something like a seizure, where a long time ago, I think prescription medicine was thought to be the only avenue. When people really try to figure out alternative forms of medicine, it's really beautiful what happens, because often the outcome is something that is, very simple and has almost no side effects. I mean, you were starting to become a vet. I have a cat, and I basically had gotten it for my girlfriend for Christmas about a year ago. And within a couple of months, it started to have really bad hip problems. So it couldn't walk up the stairs. It couldn't jump. And those are really, really strange things for a cat because they're usually very nimble. And so we went and saw a bunch of specialists, and they couldn't really figure out what was wrong with it. They said, you need to do an MRI, which will cost you about $2,000. And then if the cat needs surgery, it will cost you about $10,000. And so this was like 4 months after I got my girlfriend this cat. And so I was heartbroken, she was heartbroken. And I had a friend who was a chiropractor. And I remember hearing on the news recently about a couple of hockey players who had really bad issues, and they went and saw a chiropractor, and they were able to get an adjustment in their neck, and they felt blood flow back to their brain. And so the scientist in me was thinking, well, maybe this cat's problem is really similar. Maybe it suffered some sort of trauma, or it fell, and it hurt something in its spine, and it wasn't able to innervate its lower legs and communicate, because it was walking fine, and there were no other symptoms really. It was just, it seemed to me like an inability for its brain to communicate with its lower legs. So we went and saw a pet chiropractor, which, believe it or not, exists, and he specializes in cats and dogs. And we saw him for maybe 2 or 3 treatments that took about 10 or 20 minutes. And all he did was he literally took his fingers, and it was a really small cat, and he just kind of adjusted parts of the spine and moved his way downwards every single time we went for another visit. And believe it or not, after just one visit, the cat was running up and down the stairs. And after 3 or 4 visits, we never had to see him again. And that was the difference between finding something that was alternative and, basically essentially saving this cat's life with an alternative form of medicine, which I thought was beautiful. And that's what I think of when I think of CBD. I think of, the children who are on prescription medicine and how harmful it is for them versus something as natural as CBD that comes from a plant that can cure or almost prevent seizures entirely.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I mean, I think even with keto and epilepsy, it's really interesting how they used keto so early on, and then it kind of just fell to the background once all these anti-epileptic medications came out. But I love that it's starting to come back to the foreground as a great either complementary medicine to where they're taking medications, but they can cut back on them, or they can cut it out completely and just use it as their main therapy. But the interesting thing you're saying about the chiropractic is actually right now, I work as the academic lab manager for the basic science department at a chiropractic university. And so there is an animal chiropractor there. And I just love seeing the animals come out, because they go in kind of having a hard time walking, and they come out and they just look great.
Yeah.
So
and it's
awesome.
really surprising, right? I mean, it took me by surprise too. And I want to jump into a little bit more into gut health in general. And, just the simple question I think a lot of people might be confused on is like, why is there bacteria in our gut? Like, what purpose does it serve?
Yeah, so the gut bacteria, or the microbiome, I guess just to kind of give a description, it's this group of organisms we have organisms living throughout our body, but with the gut microbiome, obviously they're in our gut, and there's tens of trillions of these organisms living within us. And the crazy thing to me is that all of the genes that they contain outnumbers ours by a lot. I think I read it was like 3 million genes, and so everyone's going to have a different microbiome. We're going to share about 1/3 of our microbiome together, but about 2/3 of it's going to be different. So it's our own individual footprint. And so our gut bacteria is going to be influenced by our environment, but also by what we eat. And so we actually kind of live in this, when our gut's healthy, we live in this symbiotic relationship. We are basically helping them out by feeding them, and they're helping us out by providing, different ways to help our bodies as far as in our immune function, helping us digest food that we didn't completely digest in our small intestine, just so many different things, brain function, neurotransmitter, everything. I mean, they help us in so many ways. So it's this really awesome symbiotic relationship that we have with them.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, one of my next questions was regarding the symbiotic relationship with bacteria and our gut. And when people hear the word bacteria, they typically, I think, get scared, because bacteria is, often known as a bad word or a bad thing. But when you understand that, you have bacteria in your gut that relies on you and you rely on it, it's kind of a crazy concept to think about, especially to wrap your head around it, considering, how many different bacteria are in your gut. And like you said, 1/3 of it we share and 2/3 of it is unique to us. And when you think about the human genome and how similar we are to one another in terms of our genome, it's like something over 99% similarity between one human to another. So that's a big number, 2/3 uniqueness. That just shows that we should be taking care of our gut health in order to optimize our overall health, because it's one of the biggest things we can control. With regards to things that improve gut health, let's say, like a probiotic. What does a probiotic do inside the stomach or inside the gut?
Yeah, so a probiotic is going to provide us with certain strains of bacteria that may or may not be beneficial to us. And when I say may not, I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just that, once again, everybody's body is going to be different. And so what might help my own gut may not help your own, vice versa. So the probiotics themselves, they can help us. They can help to populate, like I said, certain bacteria. And so, there's actually not too much research about on probiotics themselves. There's a lot of research that shows promising things on certain strains of bacteria, but what they do find is that kind of what I just said is that in some people it's going to be beneficial, and other people it may not do anything at all. So when we take probiotics, we're kind of taking a chance on the bacteria, hoping it's going to help us with our gut health. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but in general, I think they can be very positive for people.
Right. And going along those lines, things like bone meal or collagen, how do those affect our gut health?
Oh, so those, I think, those can act a lot like prebiotics, actually. So those are things that can help feed that gut bacteria. And prebiotics are actually really important. I'm glad that you brought up the collagen and the bone meal, because a lot of people don't realize that you don't necessarily need plant fiber. You can use those as prebiotics as well. I know I've seen a lot of people using also resistant starch as prebiotic, especially if they're not getting as much plant fiber in their diet. And that's going to help to feed good bacteria in our gut.
Right. What is your opinion on plant fiber in general? I mean, I know there's a lot of mixed reviews out there, and Paul Saladino he's an avid carnivore, but he discussed the limitations of a carnivorous diet, because he said, if you're going to approach it from a carnivore perspective, then you need to be wholly invested, where it's nose to tail, that you have to consume all parts of the animal if you want to get all the vitamins and minerals and nutrients that you need. So I think a lot of people think, I'm going to go on a carnivore kick and only eat like beef patties from McDonald's. And then that way you're doing a carnivorous diet because you're only eating meat, but then you're leaving yourself out of key nutrients like, say vitamin A, which you can get from consuming animal liver, for example. So what are your thoughts on plant fiber and whether or not we need it?
So I think plant fiber can be beneficial. I personally, I tried the carnivore diet as well. And I won't lie, it is hard to take a nose to tail approach to it. And I think most people do have that problem. Like you said, they're going to just go and eat all these beef patties and not incorporate other things. But as far as plant fiber goes, I think as long as an individual knows what works well for them, as far as like if they know that a certain vegetable is going to affect them negatively, cause them bloating, any sort of problem, avoid that, but maybe start experimenting with other plants, other vegetables, to see how that might affect you. So that way you're still getting the fiber and obviously some of the nutrients from those foods.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to recognize that there is no one size fits all approach to nutrition, and that there never will be. And really, if you want to optimize your health, you're going to have to take a lot of initiative into figuring out, well, does this work well for my body or does it not? And so if keto works well for someone, it may not necessarily work for someone else. If paleo works for someone, it might not necessarily work for someone else. So I think, this cult mentality that we get, and it's bred a lot through social media, where, someone who's on a paleo kick will go on someone else's page and say, well, keto is stupid and you shouldn't be doing that. And then vice versa. I think it's really important for people to figure out, like, okay, I'm on a paleo diet. My body feels awesome. I'm not on prescription medication for blood pressure or diabetes. I feel good. I sleep well. I have no issues. Well, then that's the end of that, right? I mean, you could get all the research in the world that says sweet potatoes have antitoxins and they're not good for you. But, I mean, you're healthy and you're living a great life and you're not subjective to the downward spiral of carbohydrate consumption, which I think a lot of people are. And that goes back to the argument that keto works well for a lot of people, because I think, a lot of people tend to get hooked on sugar and carbohydrates. And when they start having a little bit, it tends to snowball into a lot. And then they start eating candy and chocolate. And then it's it's hard to get out of that kind of slump. But, it basically comes down to individuality. Do you feel good when you eat meat? If so, then keep eating it, but it takes a decent amount of initiative and self experimenting to figure out, like, does this feel good on my body? Does this feel good for me?
Yeah, no, it's so true. And it's the same thing I tell people. You need to experiment with different things, and be more in tune with your body. And I think that's been the coolest thing for me with keto is that even though I've stuck with a ketogenic diet, I've experimented with all different things, including carnivore, to kind of fine tune what's going on with myself and how I feel. But the interesting thing is that I actually had read a study that was done, I believe, at UCSF, and it's about how our diet can rapidly alter our gut microbiome. And
Right.
so it was a small sample size. They basically took 10 people and had them make an extreme diet change. And so they were previously eating like a mixed, they called it just omnivorous diet. So I'm sure just the standard American diet. And so they had them do two extreme diets, one being a plant-based diet, so fruits and veggies, I think rice. And then there was a carnivore-like diet of meat, cheese, and eggs, which also included like cured meats, deli meats. And so prior to the diet, they looked at their microbiome. They looked to see what types of bacteria they had there. And then they were asked to eat this diet for about 5 days. When that diet was done, they looked at the microbiome again. And so the group that had produced the biggest change in the microbiome was actually the animal-based diet, so the one where they only ate meat and cheese. They had the biggest and most rapid effect. It happened within about 2 days.
Right.
The thing I will point out, though, is once they stopped, within a few days, their gut flora just basically went back to the baseline. But what they did find was that they actually had high amounts of bacteria that produced short-chain fatty acids. And short-chain fatty acids normally are produced by our gut bacteria in the presence of fiber. So that was really interesting to me that they were basically wiping out a lot of their gut bacteria, but they still had this gut bacteria that was producing this without fiber. So that was, pretty interesting to me. And, short-chain fatty acids also include butyrate, which is, super important in, as anti-inflammatory effects, and also it helps to differentiate T cells. So I thought it was really interesting, and I think it shows why some people do feel better on a carnivore diet.
Right.
It causes that anti-inflammatory effect. But also there are some short chain fatty acids that when they're present in high amounts can cause inflammation. And so I think that might be why some people don't feel better once they do it.
Right, and that's good to know. It goes back to the idea of individuality. For someone who wants to, say, make sure that they have, a healthy gut microbiome, what food and drinks can they avoid that are, common and well known to damage the health of your gut bacteria? I know, and I'm guilty of drinking a Diet Coke every now and then, but I know that carbonated drinks with aspartame tend to, be very harmful on the health of your gut bacteria. But I don't know if there's other ones or if you know of any research that supports those.
I mean, I've definitely read a lot about the non-nutritive sweeteners. I know that there's a lot of controversy with that, but I have read studies that have shown that it definitely alters, your microbiome and what's in there. Another thing too would be alcohol. I mean, alcohol in general, if you're drinking excess amounts of alcohol, that can be very detrimental to your microbiome. But also excess amounts of sugar. I mean, you're going to feed the wrong bacteria, and you can also set yourself up for having, like a yeast overgrowth. I mean, it's normal. People have yeast and fungi and bacteria, all different things in their gut, but you can cause an overgrowth. So you hear of things like SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So sugar definitely would be one that, not everyone needs to be on a keto diet. I don't think that way, but if we look at our modern carbohydrate consumption, I was reading the other day that the average person eats up to 300 grams of carbs a day. And that's just extreme. And so that's definitely going to cause, a sort of dysbiosis in our gut. And that's just what's going to lead to inflammation and lead to other problems.
Yeah, and that's also really interesting. For someone who, say they, had a throat infection or a sinus infection, stomach infection, and they are on 7 to 10 days of antibiotics. So when they come off the antibiotics, well, the antibiotics have now killed, the harmful bacteria, but they've also likely killed some of the good bacteria as well. So what are some steps for people to recover from an antibiotic dose? Because, I just have to add that I think doctors do a pretty good job of making sure that you don't need them. They typically turn you away when you have a cold, and I think people get upset because they just assume they need antibiotics to get better. But I still believe it is overprescribed because people tend to be pushy with getting a prescription for them. They just think that it's going to cure all of their problems. So I think this is an important one to cover, especially in the winter time. So yeah, what can people do to recover after an antibiotic dose of a week or two?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because you're right. There are a lot of people out there that are going to push to get antibiotics, and while there are some great doctors out there that are going to, say no, there are some that are just going to give it to them just to kind of make the patient feel better, as mentally. So I would say the biggest thing is, even while you are doing antibiotics, while you're taking them, definitely do take a probiotic. That's definitely going to help maintain what you have and hopefully inoculate you with something that's going to be beneficial, especially if you didn't have it to begin with. That could be helpful. The other thing too is the same thing with the prebiotics. Make sure you're getting fiber in some form, or another food that actually contains a really beneficial short chain fatty acid is butter. Believe it or not, butter's very high in that. So that's actually very good for the gut. And then another thing would be, I've seen people taking, I haven't tried this myself, but it's definitely something I want to experiment with. And that's the potato starch as a prebiotic fiber to feed that good bacteria. But that's all stuff that you definitely want to do while you're taking antibiotics. Plus, make sure you do have a lower sugar intake if you're not already doing that, just to make sure that you're not proliferating any bad bacteria that might be sticking around. Because what's going to happen is the antibiotic is great. If you definitely have some sort of bacterial infection, it's going to kill that bacteria. But, unfortunately, it's going to kill some of your own good bacteria at the same time.
Right. And I think you just briefly mentioned, butter, but are there foods that can improve the bacteria of your gut or contain good bacteria in the food itself? Yogurt or something like that.
Yeah, so fermented foods are definitely going to be your friend in terms of keeping some good and happy bacteria in your gut. So things like, like you just said, yogurt, sauerkraut, maybe like a low sugar kombucha, things like that. Anything that's fermented is definitely going to help the gut. It's definitely going to help continuously populate your gut with good bacteria.
And what are your thoughts on things like grass-fed butter and kombucha? Do you think that they're validated in terms of, say, the premium that you'd pay for a product like that, and versus what it has, what effect it would have on your body?
So I'm going to touch on kombucha first because that's a great question. So unfortunately, a lot of the kombucha that's in the stores now, there's so many different brands that have come out. They definitely want to, appeal to people. And so they've started adding more and more sugar to it. So that way it tastes good and people want to drink it. So to me, those high sugar kombuchas, they're kind of going to, there's going to be a lot of negative effect more than there's going to be a positive, just because it's too high in sugar. That's not what kombucha was meant to be. I don't drink as much kombucha as I used to, but when I do drink it, it's definitely going to be very low in sugar, 3 to 4 grams max for me. And the stuff I see in the stores is like 10 to 15 to maybe 20 grams, which is crazy. So if you find a low sugar kombucha, that's awesome. I think that would be extremely beneficial. Now, as far as grass-fed butter, I personally will spend the extra money on grass-fed butter or even grass-fed meats. It's not always completely possible because this is real life and sometimes these things are really expensive. But when I can find deals on it, or if I know, you can get grass-fed butter at Costco. To me, those are extremely worth it. If I can supplement my diet with different foods that are of good quality here and there, that's better than not doing it at all.
Yeah, that's a really good statement. And you bring up a really good point in terms of things like kombucha. I feel like health products, things that are good for us, they tend to come to the market and then big corporations will take them and they'll find a way to sell more of it in a way that it's not typically intended to. So when acai berries and pomegranate became really popular as an antioxidant fruit over a decade ago, if you look at an acai berry or a pomegranate, if you eat the raw fruit itself, first of all, a pomegranate is extremely hard to eat. It takes a lot of work. So, how much you can consume in half an hour is probably, a small cup. And the amount of sugar that it contains relative to how much antioxidant it has, the net effect is probably positive. But then if you look at, pomegranate juice and the way it's sold and marketed in grocery stores now, if you look at a small bottle of pomegranate juice, it's essentially like a syrup. I mean, it's like 30 to 60 grams of sugar for a small cup. And the net benefits of getting that much sugar in its pure form versus how much antioxidant you're probably getting in the juice once it's processed and manufactured, it's probably way more harmful for you than it is beneficial. So I think going back to the idea of looking for pure foods, and always sticking to the raw fruit if you can get it in that form, is really important. And one of the last things I want to touch on, which I think is also extremely relevant in our, it's always been relevant, but even more so over the past year or two, I would say, is, this concept of depression and anxiety. You see it affects everyone. I mean, whether you have money, you have status, you're a celebrity, you're famous, or you think that people, might not be susceptible to it. Well, quite frankly, everyone is. And a lot of people will say that it's connected directly to your gut health, which is a reflection of things that you eat and consume. And I don't think people really get how important it is to eat well for your mental health. So can you touch a little bit on, the gut-brain connection, the vagus nerve, and why people might feel, say, depressed if they're not taking care of their diet and their gut health deteriorates?
Yeah, so, what ends up happening is in in a lot of these disorders is that what they've been finding in research is that there is a gut dysbiosis. So basically an imbalance in the types of bacteria that are housed in the microbiome. And, they're linking this dysbiosis to all sorts of health issues, IBS, IBD, allergies, obesity, diabetes, but now also they're finding it in mental health. And so what ends up happening in this dysbiosis is that you've got this instability in the diversity of the gut microbiome, and that's what drives inflammation. And that's why I was saying that the food that we eat is important and the quality is important too. And so there's a lot of good medications out there for people with mental health issues, but a lot of them fail to address the gut dysbiosis issue. But like you said, a lot is starting to come out. And it's no wonder because I think it's 90% of our serotonin and over 50% of our dopamine are produced in the gut. Wow. GABA, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which plays a role in neuronal health and also modulates our neurotransmitters. Those are also synthesized by gut bacteria. And so there's this crazy interrelationship between gut symptoms, mental health, and our microbiome is being mediated by this gut-brain axis. And so when there's this unhealthy imbalance, the bacteria in the gut are sending signals from the gut to the brain, and this can actually cause, especially in people with anxiety, a heightened stress response. They can alter tryptophan, which, is required to produce serotonin. That's mood regulating. And it's kind of a bad cycle because then, people feel this stress, which can then increase the intestinal permeability. And then you hear of things like leaky gut. That can also cause epinephrine and norepinephrine to rise, and that, further exacerbates the stress response in things like anxiety or depression.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That's. I mean, even the idea behind the serotonin, I didn't even know that. That's really interesting. And I think what's also important to address is taking care of your gut health is not just to make sure that you're not, say, depressed or anxious to come back to normal. If you don't deal with those issues and you take care of your gut health, well, now you have the chance to really improve your overall well-being. If you have elevated levels of serotonin, you may, feel more confident or have more drive, feel general well-being or happiness, let's say. So there are a ton of benefits of taking care of your diet and your gut health that I think translate to just living a long and happy life. So that's really great. I mean, I think that's a great place to end it, because that is, I think, the most important part of the the podcast, I really just wanted people to understand that their mental health can be improved through what they eat. And if you start to eat poorly, there's a downward spiral, feeling worse, which leads you to eat, I think, worse food, and then it's a tough, slippery hill to come back from.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing, I mean, this whole enteric nervous system that we have, it's crazy to think that we have these trillions of bugs that are just engaging in this crosstalk with our brains by way of our vagus nerve. And, like you said, what we eat is going to feed these bugs. The way that the bugs are going to, relay those messages in our bodies and to our brains, I mean, that's going to make a huge difference in our mental health and in our physical health.
Yeah. So to sum it up, you are what you eat. So make sure you eat quality food.
Yes. And that's why I decided to call, my whole thing Nourish My Gut, because through my own issues with autoimmune disease, which were affecting my gut, I was trying to find a way to nourish my gut per se. And it was through that I became really passionate about keto and also gut health.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you for being on the show and providing that information and value. I think listeners are really going to love this episode. If you want, I think you just mentioned it, but if you want to just share, if people want to connect with you on social media, where they can find you, say on your Instagram handle.
Yes. So on Instagram, my username is @NourishMyGut. And also I had started writing a blog. I've started writing for a blog for Life Apps. They have like a life or a fasting tracker. And so that's on lifeapps.io/NourishMyGut. And I'll provide that link to you as well in case you wanted to link that.
Sounds good.
Yeah, awesome.
All right. Thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much.